Welcome to the Infinite Jungle. On today's episode, I'm going to be talking about the main takeaways of Ethereum All-Core Developers Consensus Call number 145. Developers announced that they have indeed launched a public Pectra Testnet called Mekong very recently, so we're going to talk about the implications of that. And developers talked about some pretty interesting updates to PeerDAS development. But before we get into the show, here is a quick show disclaimer. I need to remind you to please refer to the disclaimer linked in the podcast show notes and note that none of the information in this podcast constitutes investment advice, an offer, recommendation, or solicitation by Galaxy Digital or any of its affiliates to buy or sell any securities. Developers surprised my expectations. Developers have indeed launched a public Pectra Testnet. It's called Mekong. It went live on Halloween, on October 31st. And developers are currently planning a blog post and an FAQ dedicated to that public Pectra Testnet. It is based on the Pectra Devnet 4 specifications, and as a refresher for our listeners, Pectra Devnet 4 launched about 2 weeks ago on October the 18th. And during the last ACD call, as you may remember, developers were debugging various clients on Pectra Devnet 4. And within that week's span, one of the developer operations engineers, Barnabas, who works for the Ethereum Foundation, he said that over the past week, client teams have implemented very effective fixes to the issues, and since then, there have been no major problems identified on Pectra Devnet 4. Now, of course, there are additional EIPs as well as various changes to specifications that developers are currently discussing for implementation on Pectra Devnet 5. But for now, Pectra Devnet 4 is stable. And because of the stability of Pectra Devnet 4, developers were able to launch a public version of Pectra Devnet 4 called the Mekong testnet. And if you recall, I was very skeptical that they'd be able to launch this public Pectra testnet, especially because it wasn't mentioned on the ACD call last week. And generally, when you look at the kind of debugging efforts on these devnets, the kind of bugs and issues that developers are finding through testing on these devnets, it lasts the duration of the entire lifetime of the devnet. It was quite a win, I think, for developers to have stabilized Pectra Devnet 4 so quickly. Of course, some of the concerns that I have with ongoing testing of Pectra Devnet 4 is that additional bugs will be found, as users figure out how to join the public Pectra testnet, the Mekong testnet. They may identify issues, may identify different parts of the protocol that needs to be updated, which of course would be all helpful and beneficial to the overall testing progress for Pectra. But of course, one of the downsides of that, especially if the issues that are identified creates a loss in finality or of some kind of a bug on that testnet, makes it difficult for blocks to be produced, then you can see other people trying to test out applications on Mekong also face issues. The idea is that Mekong will be it's already up and running, but that it will continue to be up and running through DevCon, which is the Ethereum Developer Conference, happening in Bangkok, Thailand in just a few weeks, through to the end of the year. That it will be a long-lived testnet that application developers, other members of the Ethereum ecosystem can join and test out and try out the new features of the protocol. Again, my concerns are really around the stability of the code. I would imagine that developers are going to continue to launch new Pectra devnets. From here on out, we're at Pectra Devnet 4. Mekong is based on those specifications, but developers are trying to add in a new EIP for Pectra Devnet 5. There are a variety of other specifications changes that they will implement in future devnets, which means the upgrade is still evolving and the upgrade is still somewhat changing. So to the extent that that impacts the kind of environment that application developers are interacting with on Mekong, I can see the effectiveness of trying to test out an application on Pectra, knowing that that Pectra upgrade may still change in the future. Could be not so palatable for people wanting to get a head start. However, for the code changes that have been implemented and tested really from Pectra Devnet 0 all the way up until 4, things like Ep.6702, the EIP that allows a new type of transaction that will make user-controlled accounts. EOA is a lot more flexible. I don't foresee a ton more changes coming to that EIP. So that, I think, is definitely robust enough for users and wallet developers to start testing on Mekong. However, in that process, maybe the wallet developers identify different issues and bugs with it still that could be implemented on future devnets. So I think it's quite new to see developers launch a public testnet for the Pectra upgrade so early on still. So that's a bit of background on the Mekong testnet. It's definitely a win for developers having already launched it. I do maintain that I'm a bit worried about the stability of that testnet and the stability of the specifications for Pectra. That being said, I'm sure there will be really good learnings from all of the users and the wallet developers and other types of network stakeholders that are going to be interacting with that testnet. So to the extent that anybody listening right now to this episode can participate in testing out the Pectra EIPs, making sure that they're robust and good to go, I think the more participation there is on the Mekong testnet, the better. So that was a win. Oh, and one note, one kind of fun fact, I guess, about how large the Mekong testnet is. It's being operated by the Ethereum Foundation. It's supported by 110 nodes. Approximately 100,000 active validators are supporting that testnet. So a pretty large effort on the part of the Ethereum Foundation to really get more community involvement and engagement in the testing of Pectra and to get people in the community involved and interested early on in and getting ready and prepared for Pectra. So we don't have a mainnet Pectra upgrade in 2024. However, developers have successfully launched a public testnet version of the upgrade that Ethereum will undergo sometime in 2025. It's almost like a sneak peek. So that was the main, I would say, DevNet update for Pectra. Then developers did talk about some of the specifications changes that they'd like to see on Pectra Devnet 5. There were a couple of fixes that need to be made on various EIPs. Mikhail, one of the Teku developers, were talking about adding missing checks to validator consolidation requests. There were no updates to the BLS precompile repricing conversation. If you need a refresher on that conversation, please do refer to the prior Infinite Jungle episode on the ACD call. There were no updates really on that. There was a couple of very interesting updates, though, on PeerDAS development. And as a refresher, PeerDAS has been punted to the next upgrade after Pectra. PeerDAS is a major networking change to Ethereum that will greatly enhance the ability of Ethereum to scale as a DA layer. However, the concerns about PeerDAS is that it's not ready for implementation on mainnet. And developers, in parallel to working on Pectra, they're working on PeerDAS to ensure that it hopefully will be ready for Fusaka, which is the name of the upgrade after Pectra. Developers have done about 4 devnets testing out PeerDAS thus far. And PeerDAS Devnet 3, developers always start the count, I guess, for these devnets from 0. So that's why I say it's the 4th PeerDAS Devnet, but it's formally called the PeerDAS Devnet 3 network. So PeerDAS Devnet 3 was recently shut down. And the reason why was because there was a reported 100,000 slot reorganization. And what this means is there was potentially a 100,000 sized block reorganization. So effectively, almost like the entire chain was reorged. That means a different version of the blockchain was replaced the canonical version of the blockchain. If you think about blockchains as like a progression of blocks, the blockchain progressed 100,000 blocks ahead, and then it completely rewrote that history. And developers said that it was simply unfeasible to try and recover the network from such a deep, such a serious incident. There wasn't really much talk on the call about why that incident happened on the PeerDAS Devnet. The Prism team, the Prism client team, is investigating the matter. So hopefully we'll have more details about why this happened in future calls. But it's not too big of a deal because, number one, as I said, the PeerDAS upgrade is still highly experimental. It's something that developers knew would not be ready in time with the other Pectra EIPs, which is why it was siloed out to allow developers more time to figure out PeerDAS. And developers, according to the last ACDC call that we had agreed to start rebasing all of the work they've done for PeerDAS on top of Pectra specifications. Up until now, developers have been working on the PeerDAS code changes, the networking changes on top of Denkun, which was the latest upgrade to go live on Ethereum mainnet. And because it's already live on Ethereum mainnet, there's no more specifications changes to Denkun. It's a very stable code base to be working off of. But now that Pectra is becoming more or less stable, developers are trying to rebase all of the PeerDAS work that they've done so far onto Pectra. And this is primarily the work that they will focus on rather than, trying to recover PeerDAS Devnet 3, do more testing and relaunch another DevNet instead of moving on to PeerDAS Devnet 4. Barnabas was talking about how client teams are heads down working on that rebasing, and we'll probably focus on that rebasing until after DevCon, the Ethereum conference. And along this note, talking about the rebasing efforts, Barnabas asked whether developers had any thoughts or considerations around renaming the PeerDAS upgrade to be part of the Fusaka upgrade. So when you launch a DevNet, you can schedule it and you can code it in such a way that upgrade happens either as a standalone EIP, so just the PeerDAS upgrade happening on its own on that DevNet, or that PeerDAS upgrade can happen as the Fusaka upgrade, as the upgrade to the execution layer and the consensus layer of Ethereum. Fusaka is the name of the next Ethereum upgrade, and it will update the execution layer and the consensus layer. Developers had agreed to slate EOF and PeerDAS for Fusaka in earlier calls. But, of course, Fusaka is a bit far away. Pectra is likely to be activated on mainnet, say, in March or April of next year, and it'll take developers at the very least, likely 6 months, probably longer, to prepare the Fusaka upgrade for mainnet. So that's quite a bit of time, which is why Barnabas asked, should PeerDAS continue to be tested on DevNets as a standalone EIP, as a standalone code change, or if developers should do the work now to rename and to execute PeerDAS as part of the Fusaka upgrade. And if developers do that, if developers move ahead with testing PeerDAS as part of the Fusaka upgrade, it could be that down the road, as they're testing PeerDAS, they may have to test PeerDAS alongside these other code changes like EOF as they become ready on the execution layer side. If by chance developers decide that they don't want to have PeerDAS in the Fusaka upgrade for whatever reason, they would have to just do some work to update the EIP and the code changes such that it's a standalone EIP again and not tethered to the Fusaka upgrade. So that conversation was a bit challenging for developers to think about right now because developers are very focused on Pectra, and it is hard to say what the priorities of developers will be in 6-9 months from now. There wasn't many comments on what Barnabas was asking. Alex, who was moderating the call, who usually is now the chair of these calls ever since Danny Ryan, who was the former chair of the ACDC calls, announced his departure from the Ethereum Foundation. Alex, who now chairs the call, he was saying that developers should rediscuss this topic of conversation for the next ACD call. He did mention that in his opinion, he does think that developers should work on the PeerDAS upgrade as if it is definitely going to be in the Fusaka upgrade. And he was not alone in this sentiment. There was a Geth developer by the pseudonym Light Client who was mentioning in the chat, the Zoom chat of the call, that PeerDAS is, quote, the most important thing to ship for Ethereum in the next upgrade, which is going to be Fusaka. He mentioned that if EOF is ready for activation on mainnet ahead of PeerDAS, those code changes should be delayed, should wait until the PeerDAS upgrade is ready to go and can be implemented alongside the two in tandem for the Fusaka upgrade. I would say that there was quite a bit of concern related to pre-slating the Verkle upgrade for Fusaka before Pectra. So there has been an incident in recent memory of developers pre-committing to upgrades far in advance of an upgrade actually happening, and down the line, developers changing their minds. And this being a bit of a painful process to try and go back on. For developers to have delayed Verkle further and now scheduled PeerDAS and EOF for Fusaka rather than the Verkle upgrade, that was not an easy decision for developers to come to. It took so long for developers to really decide on the Pectra split, to split out the Pectra upgrade into two. So I would hope that developers shy away a little bit from doing that again, from pre-committing code changes to a particular upgrade. Yes, there is soft confirmation that both EOF and PeerDAS are going into the Fusaka upgrade, but priorities can change. And leaving the door open to that kind of possibility, I think, gives developers a lot more wiggle room, and it will allow the governance related to what gets prioritized for Fusaka to happen a lot more naturally, and it doesn't pigeonhole developers too much into a certain development roadmap that they may not want to go ahead with when the time comes after Pectra gets activated on mainnet and they really start to focus their full attention onto Fusaka. So that being said, I think all of this indication that PeerDAS is a shoo-in for Fusaka is healthy. It's good to know that PeerDAS is, developers still have a very positive outlook on PeerDAS being activated sooner rather than later. But again, I highlight that it's not just PeerDAS that developers had decided on in prior governance calls to include in Fusaka. And to the extent that developers want to give assurances of keeping PeerDAS into Fusaka, EOF plays a big part in that discussion, as the governance decision that was made on prior calls formally was to include both into the next upgrade. Finally, a couple of other quick things that were mentioned on the call that I thought would be good to mention on this episode of the Infinite Jungle. One of them was around a new EIP that was proposed. I think developers are always concerned when a new EIP is discussed on the call, for fear that an additional EIP is going to get included into Pectra. But as a caveat, as a note just up front, this EIP was not proposed for inclusion in Pectra. It was proposed as a nice to have in a future upgrade after Pectra. And this EIP was presented by Lucas. He is a lead blockchain protocol engineer for Consensus. Consensus funds two Ethereum clients, a consensus layer client and an execution layer client. Lucas proposed EIP 7800, and it basically enables validators to update their withdrawal credentials. This would be a nice to have because within Pectra, validators will be able to trigger several operations: validator deposits, validator withdrawals, validator consolidations. But for validators that are currently active on Ethereum, in order to update your withdrawal credentials such that they're controlled by a smart contract, would require fully exiting that validator and reactivating it, restaking your 32 ETH, and updating the withdrawal credentials that way. So there's no easy way to go about updating your withdrawal credentials while still keeping your validator active, and exit is required. So to prevent this kind of cycling that might be needed for large swaths of validators that are currently operating and relying on the intervention of somebody holding the private keys of that validator to be able to trigger these operations, to kind of encourage that transition to using smart contracts. This EIP offers a new mechanism for validators to update those withdrawal credentials through a new execution request type, 0x03. There was already a few developers on the call that mentioned their support for such an EIP. Prism developer PeerDAS and Mikhail, a Teku developer, said that this would not be an arduous or difficult change. It would be a relatively simple EIP to implement. So one EIP that I'm sure we have not heard the last of. So developers will likely discuss it potentially, even for the Fusaka upgrade. And one final note, this is an aspect of the call that I didn't actually include in the ACD call write-ups. I very rarely leave things out of the full call write-ups, which you can always find linked in the show notes. This one I left out because it was an announcement of an announcement. So I figure, when the announcement is actually made, I can include it in the write-up then. But one of the reasons why I want to mention it on the call is because, again, I think this is really important for developers to be aware of in how this particular project and experiment impacts governance decisions. So Probe Lab, which is a blockchain data analytics company, I mentioned them on a prior Infinite Jungle episode. They are doing some deep research into how blob activity is impacting validator nodes. They're doing some research on the bandwidth usage of Ethereum nodes, hopefully to inform exactly by how much developers should increase the blob capacity. And as we discussed on prior calls, developers have already agreed to include EIP.7742, which is an uncoupling of the blob count between the consensus layer and the execution layer. And this will make it easier for developers to implement a blob capacity increase. However, they haven't decided on how much that increase should be. The current capacity is a target of 3 blobs per block. And at the time when developers, even before they decided about the EIP.7742 code change, they had said that one of the pivotal precursors to making that decision, making that call of including a blob capacity increase, would be more data on how blobs currently, since Denkun, have been impacting validator node operators. The concern is that increases to the blob capacity will negatively impact the number of solo stakers on Ethereum and therefore negatively impact the decentralization of the Ethereum network. But even without having, I think, robust data presented on the calls, developers did go ahead with including EIP.7742. And I think it would be a shame for developers to also include a blob capacity increase on Ethereum without having done the work that they said they would need and that they would require to go ahead with a blob capacity increase. Tony, an Ethereum Foundation researcher, has done some preliminary research on this, although there wasn't really a robust discussion about the data that they're finding around validator node bandwidth requirements. There hasn't really been a discussion on the data yet, which developers, again, said in prior calls that was a very necessary part to how they should go about making this decision. So one of the things I like to do with my ACD call write-ups is remind developers about the decisions that were made on prior calls and to hold developers accountable for what they said they would do. Or if not, to make note of that and to very clearly say, this This was how a decision was going to be made, but lo and behold, that decision was simply made or made in a different way. So we're not sure if a blob capacity increase is going to be included in Pectra. The inclusion of EAP7742, as I said in a prior episode, does make it likely that the increase is coming, but hopefully developers are still relying and still wanting to dig into the data to inform that decision by how much they should increase the blob capacity, if at all. It could be that the data shows a blob capacity increase by any amount. Any departure, any increase from the target of 3 would not be healthy for the decentralization of Ethereum. I don't think that's what the data will say. However, that is a possibility. And to the extent that the data informs the final decision of developers related to the blob capacity increase, I think the better, because that is what developers said that they would do. So there you have it. A little bit of a note of why that Probe Lab announcement is something that I'm looking forward to. Probe Lab said that the analysis and the data research that they're doing should be ready by the time of DevCon, which is mid-November. So ideally, I will have more to report then. And it's, something to keep an eye out for on future calls. As another note, which I will remind my listeners of next week, developers will be taking a 1-week break from these ACD calls while they're attending the Ethereum Developer Conference, DevCon. I too will be attending that conference. And so there will be no ACD call summary, as there will be no ACD call scheduled on that week. But anyways, not something to be thinking about exactly right now because developers still have one more call to go before DevCon. And it is the great ACDE number 200 call that's going to be coming up. So I will definitely have to think of something special to do for, celebrating, I guess, the great 200 mark of having 200 governance calls thus far on Ethereum. But anyways, I'll have a think of that. Thank you, everyone, for listening to another episode of The Infinite Jungle. I appreciate everyone so diligently tuning in and keeping themselves updated about the state of Pectra and Ethereum protocol development. I hope that you learned something new about Ethereum on today's episode. And I am signing off from the concrete jungle that is New York City in your explorations of the infinite jungle that is Ethereum. Stay safe out there.